Okay, we're recording. So welcome everyone to this session of the In Character um, series of videos that people from the Character Project, which is organized by Wake Forest University, are completing. So the Character Project is a multidisciplinary effort led by Christian Miller, Will Fleeson, and Mike Furr to bring scholars together to study the nature of moral character. So today, we're going to be the two of us talking about our work on moral character. On one side of your screen is Sara Konrath. She's at Indiana University as an assistant professor in the Department of Philanthropic Studies.
And I'd like to introduce you to Erik Helzer, who is at the Carey Business School at Johns Hopkins University. And you're in your first year, right?
First year, yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about what the Department of Philanthropic Studies is, Sara?
Yeah, so I think often when I tell people that I work at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, people immediately wonder when I'm going to ask them for a donation. I didn't expect that, but that's happening. And so I have to quickly be like, oh, no, we're studying sort of the reasons why people give and traits related to giving. It encompasses both the nonprofit sector, so like formal giving, donations, volunteering, and also the actual organizations themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But as a psychologist, what I study is a little bit of the formal giving, but a lot of informal giving and traits related to giving, like empathy and narcissism.
Mm-hmm.
And you're at the business school, but you're also a social psychologist?
I'm also a social psychologist at the business school in my first year, and at a school here at Johns Hopkins that the charter is doing business with humanity in mind. So there's a big interest in topics related to ethics, related to medicine and improving people's lives. Of course, because we're at Hopkins, and so it's a way of trying to understand some of the things that we're dealing with in the Character Project. In a business setting, you're trying to understand those at the organizational level and the kinds of practices that bring about ethical business and the kinds of practices that bring about ethical leaders.
And so, I guess before you got there, you were working with participants who were mostly college students. Is that right?
So a lot of my graduate school work was working with college students, and in the postdoc, which I did at Wake Forest with Will Fleeson and Mike Furr, most of our participants were actually community members. So we would bring people in either from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, which is where we were, or reach out via online opportunities to get a broader national sample of people to take part in our studies.
And now, are you ever doing any work actually in organizations?
It's a transitional period. So yes, the goal would be to eventually do some work within specific organizations to look at how their practices play out in sort of the ethical realm. We are doing some work where you try to sample from working Americans. They may not all be at the same organization, but at different places in the organizational hierarchy. And so that's been a fun challenge to get people to take time out of their workday to tell us about what's going on in their work.
Oh, like is it experience sampling?
Yeah, so we just finished, a colleague and I just finished an experience sampling study, and so we'll talk more about that for viewers a little later, but it's a fairly intensive study where we sample people 5 times a day for 7 days and try to get a snapshot of their life at that moment and the moments preceding it. So tell me, Sara, so you've been doing some really interesting work on empathy and prosociality, and I know that the work you did for the Character Project came out of other work you were doing. So can you give us kind of the roadmap for where you were and how you got to the work you're doing at the Character Project and what that work was?
Yeah, so the background, like the research that inspired my Character Project work was research I had done both for my dissertation and early on when I was assistant professor at University of Michigan, where we were tracking traits over time, I guess I'd say morally relevant traits, narcissism and empathy. And we found that using a method called a cross-temporal meta-analysis, which is when we take data that is published or unpublished from a particular personality scale and look at what happens to it over time. We found that narcissism had been rising among American college students, and at the same time, in a separate paper, we found that empathy, dispositional empathy, had been declining among American college students. And we study college students only because they're very widely studied, so we had data available all the way back from the late 70s to the present. So we were able to actually track the same population over time. It was around the same age, but the only change was the time period.
So narcissism going up, empathy going down. Is that a necessary relationship? Could you see one of those things without the other? I'm just kind of curious. Are they overlapping to that degree?
They are overlapping. People who score high on the trait of narcissism tend to also score low on the trait of empathy, but it's not 100% overlap. And of course, I could imagine there would be a person who's narcissistic and also empathetic, or who's empathetic and narcissistic, but on average they go together.
Okay. And so did you have ideas about why you might be seeing these trends? Like what was happening over time? Maybe as the end of days approach? That's a
our study was very clearly only just documenting the change itself, so we actually had no way of measuring why the changes happened, but I think many people, and ourselves included, have been guessing about why these changes might have happened, and I think the best approach that I can't come up with is a very kind of multi-dimensional approach where we consider different levels of analysis. So thinking of what was happening, from the late 70s to 2009 for our empathy data, what was happening in the home to people, what was happening in their schools, and we see, the rise of the self-esteem movement around that time in schools, and what was happening in other domains like media, politics, economics. There's so many different changes that were occurring. But what inspired me to do the work for the character project was that we found that for the empathy study that the biggest changes started to occur around the year 2000. So we started to wonder, what was it about that time period that would perhaps lead to the bigger changes? And we just thought maybe there's something about new media and new technology, and perhaps that in some ways this technology can distance us, while at the same time it obviously does connect us. I mean, here we are, you and I,
right,
together, using new technology. So there's complex implications of it, but at the very least, we spend a lot more time with screens over time, I think, and that, if anything, even if there's no effect separately of the actual devices we're using, there's just less time for face-to-face communication with each other.
So would the idea be that if we're spending less time, almost like a practice effect, if we're spending less time actually interacting with one another and trying to understand each other, that the effect of that is we're not using our empathy, so we kind of lose it? I mean, is that the idea?
That's our idea. Now again, we're just speculating that this could be what's going on, and it's very hard to test an idea like that. But but we thought that if we did find empathy is declining, and if one of the causes happens to be new technology, then we wondered whether there's a way we can use new technology, in particular mobile phones, to promote social good. And so for the character project, we were funded to run a study, just basically a test case study to see if it's possible to use mobile phones to increase people's empathy and pro-social behavior. And so we used college students again, just because I was, again, an available population, but we had a pilot sample of 90 people, and some of them received messages on 6 times a day, actually, that reminded them to think about others. And there's different aspects to empathy, so we were careful to think about those different aspects, including more cognitive aspects like perspective taking. So I have actually some examples. Let me see. So, for example, think about your last social interaction. What obstacles or challenges does the person face? Try to see these problems from their point of view. So it's very didactic, teachy,
Sure.
but it's meant to be reminders of things that people might already be wanting to do or might be part of their life, but they're just kind of busy. We also had more emotional aspects of empathy. So an example would be focus on connecting with and feeling close to the person you last interacted with, no matter who they are. So it could be, a clerk at a store, but we just want people to start practicing the feelings of connection and care for others.
So was it always probably think about the last interaction you had and then try to sort of mentally go into one of these states with that person?
It wasn't always.
Uh-huh.
Many of them were like that because when we first tried to write the messages, we didn't know we didn't want it to become a problem for the actual ongoing social interaction. So for example, you and I are talking and then I get a text message that says like, okay, like imagine what he's thinking. But the fact that I got this text message was like super rude and just interrupted our conversation.
Right.
And so it's not empathetic. And so we had to think through like, how can we do this in a way that's kind of seamless so that if people are in the middle of doing something, they can go to their phones later and check out the message.
Yeah.
And, a lot of empathy is imagination. It's just, imaginatively engaging with others and their emotions and their mindsets. And so with imagination, you can go back in time, you can go forward in time, and you can also be engaging in the moment in your imaginative stance with the other person. So we thought it was important to include both of those things. And then also, at the same time, we included a behavioral measure, or behavioral instruction. So asking them to also do some sort of small, kind act to somebody else.
Was that every message they got, or every once in a while they get the message, do something kind?
So there was 21 total messages, and then they were divided into emotional, cognitive, and behavioral.
Okay.
The reason we thought behavioral was important is because I think although the behavior itself is not empathy, it can be a consequence of empathy. Dan Batson's work shows that when people are in the mindset of feeling others' emotions, an empathic mindset, that it inspires them to act in a way that's pro-social and to help others. And so we thought, if we're trying to increase empathy, well, why? Why would we even try to do that? And it's because ultimately, besides having people become more empathetic, we also think it's important for them to increase their pro-social behavior to a variety of people. So we included those together.
So anyway. So if I'm in this study, I'm getting these text messages 6 times a day that are giving me some kind of it's like an empathy workbook or something, right? I get one little message from the empathy workbook, and I do that for what, a minute, 2 minutes? Do you specify?
It's just to do that. Some of the instructions said, for the next 30 seconds. Some of them didn't give a time.
Yeah.
And people could choose to, we didn't actually incentivize whether they responded or not.
Yeah.
We just really believe that people should intrinsically decide if they want to follow the instruction or not.
Okay.
And then there was also 2 control groups, and it was just a small pilot, so we had to collapse them. But one of the control groups was just no messages, and the other one was what we considered sort of like a low empathy group, but it was kind of a combination of different kinds of being low in empathy. So one kind is like, if I'm low in empathy, it might be because I'm thinking of myself, so self-esteem only, like self-focus. And another way of being low in empathy is emotional distance. So just like when a person is feeling some negative emotion, you can just step back and not really get involved. And that's not really being self-focused, but it's also not being empathetic. And in future work, we'd love to be able to tease out some of these important distinctions and how they matter in terms of affecting people's pro-social behavior. But for now, this was again just a test case to see if this is even possible to do with cell phones. And the reason we thought it might be is because people in public health have been using text messages as a public health tool for the last decade.
Yeah.
I think social psychologists are a little behind on using these really important ways of engaging with people in their everyday life. Of course, we have less control than in a laboratory setting.
Sure.
But also because it's in someone's everyday life, we have a lot more validity in an ecological way, in the sense of that we can generalize to their everyday circumstances.
Absolutely. So okay, everybody's waiting. What were the results?
Well, the results were complicated. Okay. So I'll try and see if I can make sense of them. Maybe you can help me make sense of them. So we had different measures. We had a lot of measures of empathy, because empathy is this complicated thing that's hard to define, hard to measure. Researchers all have their different definitions, and I tried to think about different aspects of it. So we included both self-reported trait type of empathy measure,
Mm-hmm.
and also an internal kind of, I'd call it like an inner character, if you're going to use the word character. So something like the emotional response to others or the motivation to help them. So there's more like what's making people want to help.
Okay.
And then the third types of measures, and we had a few of each of these kinds, but the third type was behavioral, so an actual behavioral in-lab helping task. So what we found, so they received these messages 6 times a day for 2 weeks, and we brought them back into our lab.
And you gave them the very same things you gave them at the time one.
So any results we found were controlling for their own baseline scores.
Uh-huh.
And what we found was that people who had been in the empathy training group had higher, more like inner empathic characters, so they had more motivation to help, and they had been able to limit their personal distress responses, which can also help people to care for others and to help. And sometimes when we get overwhelmed with our own emotions, then we don't want to help because we can't really take it. We just want to escape helping.
Right.
So that was nice to see that this motivational component was affected.
So people are saying after this training, I want to relieve the suffering of others. It affects me when I'm. Is there a line between being affected by the suffering of others and then this personal distress thing? Help me understand that distinction.
Well, I think that it's, first of all, I think oftentimes they can be correlated, but they can also be distinguished. It's about where the focus of emotion is. So when something bad happens, like someone, a friend of yours has a parent who dies,
Mm-hmm.
you can go like, oh my God, I can't take this. I don't know what to say. Like, I'm really uncomfortable. Like, what if this happened to my family? There's so many ways to like make it about yourself.
Yes.
Which is obviously not the empathic response.
Yes.
And the more empathic response is like a feeling of compassion and concern that's about the other person and sort of directed toward their needs instead of your own needs. And sometimes they do overlap a bit, but the part that predicts later helping is the compassionate response.
Okay, so that's the sort of stuff that was showing an increase after your intervention.
So that's the inner character, and at the same time, we also found evidence that what I call outer character, so the behavioral observed aspects of empathy or prosociality, were also affected. So people in the empathy training group were more likely to offer, sorry, I always get this wrong. Both groups were equally willing to help someone in distress, but the empathy training group were willing to help more hours.
Okay.
So it's just a bit of a deeper helping. And they also, people who were observing these people and didn't know which condition they had or which training they had, saw them as more empathetic if they had received empathy training.
Their behavior, so that when they watched them help, they saw that as being more empathetic, or they just...
The helping task was blind.
Okay.
But it was a research assistant who just rated them at the end and just, how empathetic do you think this person is? And they didn't know which condition they're in because that was all done on the cell phone behind the scenes. And they rated the person as more empathetic if they had received the empathy training.
Wow, so even the person being helped, it's almost a qualitatively different kind of helping, right? It's detectable. So is this consistent with what you found? So if you had one person in your empathy training group and one person in your control condition, both of whom helped the experimenter, is what you're saying that the experimenter, in addition to using observable behavior, also would feel like the person in your empathy?
Oh, I'm sorry. I think that we have a bit of a methods.
Okay.
I should explain the methods better. We used a classic helping task called the Katie Banks task, where there's a woman who's supposedly another college student from the same college whose parents have just died, and now she has to take care of her siblings, but if she's taking care of them, she can't really complete her college degree, so she's really freaking out. And it's a radio program about this story about this woman who supposedly is from the same campus, and they have a chance to actually, on a form from the radio station, they have a chance to respond and help her, and then they send the form to the radio station. The research assistant, who has no idea what condition they've been in or whether they've helped or not, just at the end of the interacting with this person, just mundane interactions, thinks that the people who have been trained to be empathetic seem to be more empathetic.
Gotcha.
So it
these differences in behavior, and they're detectable from an outside perspective. So then what did people feel about themselves post-training?
well, that's the most interesting part, I think, is that after receiving 6 messages a day to remind people to be more empathetic, the people who had been in that condition actually, when we asked them, they actually said they were less empathetic. So
Less empathetic than the other group and less empathetic than what they said at time one?
We are comparing the two groups. So
Okay.
controlling for their own
Controlling for.
baseline, there is and compared to the other group, they were less empathetic. They saw themselves less empathetic. So in other words, they say I'm not very empathetic, but they're having empathetic motivations and pro-social behaviors. So it's kind of a bit of a puzzle.
So what are the kinds of questions on the self-report scale, just to get a feel for what they were diminishing their beliefs about?
That was the Davis Interpersonal Reactivity Index, which is one of the most widely used measures of empathy, and in particular the empathic concern subscale that they declined on. And an example item would be, I often have tender, concerned feelings for people who are less fortunate than me. So after being in a mode for 2 weeks where they're supposedly getting in, like imagining other people's perspectives and feeling with them, they're saying that they're not the kind of people who would actually do that.
Huh. That's really okay. So, but they are reporting, right, that their empathic responses were going, right. That's the internal piece of this.
Yeah.
Right. So they're feeling more empathic response, but maybe it's that that question you said, I often, right. Maybe what's happened is they've redefined what often means.
I mean, maybe. I mean, that's just one sample item. The items don't often. I'll include that. But I mean, I think that there's a couple things to think about when it comes to this strange finding. One is that if we found all of the effects going in the direction of empathy training makes people more empathetic, that would be cool, and that's really what we were hoping for. But we wouldn't be able to rule out the idea of just social desirability, that people have had all these text messages for 2 weeks and they kind of figured out what we're doing. They want to give us the right answer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think we can think about the fact that they see themselves as less empathetic as evidence that they're not just trying to say what we think they should say.
Right.
But I think what's happening is that they're basically, by getting the messages every day, and especially 6 a day, which is a lot, and it's among the higher doses I've seen in the literature, from public health. But that many messages a day, I think, makes them actually feel like in contrast to this standard that's really high about what it means to be a kind person. They suddenly go like, that's not me. Like maybe, for example, they got a message and they didn't do the thing. Maybe once in a while they didn't do what they were supposed to do. Or maybe once in a while they found it really annoying. And then they started telling themselves, well, that must mean there's something, that I'm not a nice person.
Right.
So I don't know, and that's just what I'm guessing. But we also did something 6 months later to see if these effects would last, because that's, I think, an important question. If we're going to claim that we're helping people to have more empathic habits using this kind of method, then, well, let's see if it's really a habit, and if 6 months later there's still some evidence that it works.
Sure.
So 6 months later, we send them a text message. Now they don't know it's from our research team. It's by now, hopefully they've forgotten about us, but it's just from a phone number that would not come up in any searches and that they've never seen before.
Mm-hmm.
And the message says, "Stop texting me, you jerk." And what we did as a research team is recorded their responses verbatim to see, exactly what they said, and then we had coders who were not aware of the conditions that they had, the training that they had received, rated these responses for how pro-social or how not aggressive or whatever they were.
So in other words, I might get this text message, stop texting me, you jerk. And what you're looking for as the researcher is how I respond to that message. Okay.
Yeah, and it's not exactly a measure of empathy in the sense that when you think about empathy in a sort of traditional sense, it's about responding to other people's suffering.
Mm-hmm.
But in some ways, it can also, I think, inhibit our aggressive responses to people, because if we stop for a moment and imagine what it's like for them or what's going on in their emotional world, it's hard to want to hurt them.
Right.
So this is more of a test of more of like aggression. and or not. I don't know exactly what it is. It's sort of like fuzzy, but it's not. It's not a response to someone in distress. It's not like someone saying, "Please help! I need your help right now! Help!" You know.
Well, in some ways, it is a response to someone in distress, just not the kind of distress that you usually think about, right? This person's clearly distressed, and
Yeah.
they're sort of like taking it out on you on accident.
Exactly. And actually, one of our nicer participants responded by saying, like in a very, I thought, empathetic way, by saying, "I'm so sorry you're having a bad day, and I think you might have the wrong number though." And I think that that's a really nice way to handle that, somebody who's clearly sort of unprovoked, mild hostility.
Yeah.
I mean, if you and I think for a moment what we might say, who knows how nice it would be, right? But
I might not say anything. I might just. I mean,
not saying,
that's kind of impressive that people are responding at all in some
well,
ways.
only about half of the participants did, and most of them did within 5 minutes.
Uh-huh.
In fact, even a couple of them called.
Wow, they called the They called the Confederate or whoever was sending the text.
Yeah, but we didn't answer the phone because it was
Sure.
part of the study. So,
Sure, right.
but anyway, so what we found was that the people who were in the empathy condition had more prosocial responses to that semi-hostile provocation, even 6 months later. So that to me, I think the evidence is a little bit mixed. It's not perfect, and it's such a small sample size. We could really use a larger one. In fact, right now we're following up by running a very large study, which is going to be on teenagers, and we're trying to examine again whether this program works. We call it Text to Connect, and then also what's the optimal amount of messages a day. So we're giving people between 1, 3, and 5 messages every day. When we interviewed teenagers, they were like, "We do not want 6." So we kind of we put it lower, but we'll see what happens.
So do you have a sense for, you measured all these components of things that each one of them, I think, if you asked me, I'd say, yeah, that seems like empathy. That seems like empathy. But sometimes things that all seem like the same thing aren't the same thing. So do you have any sense for, I know you mentioned measurement as a tricky issue in this field, as it is in many fields. What is the relationship that you've observed between these different pieces? I mean, you can imagine that a person would show a lot of increases, for example, in the internal part of empathy, but for other reasons might not then go on to help. So what have you found in terms of how all of these pieces come together? Is it a coherent thing, or is it almost like different skill sets?
I think it's kind of an empirical question to some extent, and one of the things I'd like to do is, like, in the baseline data, we have so many different ways of measuring this prosociality, I call it, maybe because it includes like behavior.
Sure.
And I would like to just basically examine to what extent some of these things go together. In the prior research, like there's research suggesting that people, when people see themselves as empathetic, they're more likely to help. So that the trait version is associated with the behavior, and that the motivation, those feelings, the people who have the trait are more likely to feel compassion and more likely to help. So it seems like they all should fit together, but I don't think it's going to be that simple. There are just so many different ways of operationalizing, and I think there's probably going to be some sense of overlap, but my guess is there is going to be some clusters.
Right.
And I don't know if they're going to cluster the way I expect, which is the more motivational, behavioral, and then self-perception, because there's also the cognitive aspect of it, and then there's like the term you use, like the skill set. So there's some aspects of what we might call empathy or prosociality that you could just like learn. So I don't know. I think it's something we need to do, because oftentimes researchers will do some sort of, they'll study. First of all, empathy is really widely studied, and it's becoming more and more popular as a topic of study, but it doesn't seem like we have a very clear idea of what the definition is or how to measure it. And what one researcher says is empathy, and look, they did this and they found that empathy predicts this. Another researcher uses totally different measures and finds like the opposite, maybe.
Right.
So I think it really matters, but it's really hard to tease apart, because it's something that's also kind of intuitive, and we all think in our personal lives that we understand what it is, because it's something we all experience on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm.
So it's one of those things that I think that the literature needs a bit of organizing, maybe.
Sure.
Anyway, I'm very curious about what you've been doing and what you worked on in the Character Project. Now, you did a postdoc. Was that part of, like, was it like part of the character project that, like, I don't know how it works. I know if I was an outside person who got funding from them, so they had inside people too, I guess.
They had an inside job. The way this worked was that the team of Christian, Will, and Mike got a very large grant that was in part to support research activities at Wake Forest,
Okay.
and was in other part to fund other researchers in other places to do work relevant to character. So it was scholars in psychology, philosophy, and theology. So there was work being done in all three areas, and some of that was being done at Wake Forest, which is where I was involved, and it was sort of the mothership of the whole thing. And we had a lot of work that was going on there, asking a bunch of different questions about character. And then the other work that was being done was the grant winners like you and others who proposed projects that were then chosen as important and something to fund. So as a result, I spent 2 years at Wake Forest and in the psychology department, had the opportunity to do a bunch of different research on questions of character. And a lot of that work was you talk about the difficulty of measuring empathy, and there's lots of different ways to do it and conceive of it, and that's true of probably any character trait. Character traits are tricky because there's so much that's this internal part, the motives, the way you think about things, and then the external part, the behaviors, what you do. So a lot of our work was, the historical background of the study of character is that psychologists were initially quite interested in the idea that the explanation for why people act in moral or immoral ways is to be found within the person, right? It's in their disposition. And then there was a period of decades where social psychologists like you and me did studies looking at how variable people's behavior was when they got into different situations. And because of that work, people sort of lost interest for a long time in this idea that, well, maybe there's something about the person, him or herself, that is consistent and that disposes certain people towards more or less moral behavior. So a lot of the work we were doing, go ahead.
It seems like a fair critique to say that if people are really, if they really have a moral character trait, then why should the situation influence them so much? Like, like the classic Good Samaritan study, right?
Yes. So, I think there's a couple things to think about there. One is it's an issue that's been brought up in virtue ethics and philosophy, which is, does having a moral character trait require that you never act counter to your disposition? So if you're an honest person, right, is one requirement of being an honest person that you almost never act in a dishonest way? And some people would say yes, and other people would say, well, no, we have to allow for some variability because sometimes even honest people are going to be dishonest. And so so that's an interesting philosophical issue, right? Are we talking about these kind of units of there's honest and dishonest, or are we talking about a continuum of behavior, which is how psychologists tend to think about everything, which is, honesty is distributed normally, and some people show more honesty than others, and some people show less. It's just like extroversion, right? Which is something people usually are fine thinking of as a trait. Sometimes really extroverted people are quiet, and sometimes really introverted people are sociable and loud, right? And and we wouldn't say that. I'm getting a little feedback. I don't know why. Okay. And we wouldn't say when the extroverted person is being quiet that kind of disqualifies them from ever being thought of as extroverted. So it's an interesting question. Go ahead.
That's why when I say that these issues seem fuzzier because they're moral and because we have like strong emotional responses to the moral traits in a way we might not to like extroversion.
Yeah.
Right, because we don't want someone to lie to us. Because it affects people's relationships and also our society, right? We don't want like people in businesses to be lying,
right?
And so on, right?
So what you're saying is that one reason we might not tolerate dishonesty from the honest person is that the consequences of that are different than the consequences of the extroverted person being quiet, for example.
Right, and also just I think it's also harder for us to just step back and kind of do that kind of more logical, cool analysis of like, well, of course, an honest person is going to be dishonest once in a while. Like I think we see the dishonesty that happens maybe only like if I think if you gave people a scenario where you said this person was honest in 99 times, 99 times out of 100, but there one time they were dishonest, and then if you give them a similar scenario that says this person was honest 50 times out of 100, but the other 50 times they were dishonest.
Yeah.
I think that people would see them both as dishonest.
That would be, I mean, I think that's an interesting question. I think, though, that there's an important difference in kind between those two people, right? So say you could pick only one of those to be your colleague. Who would you choose?
Well, totally.
I mean, I agree. I think that it's tempting to want these traits to be things that cannot be violated, right? That people simply are honest or dishonest. But one of the things we were doing in our work is trying to say, well, let's just see if we can observe the kind of consistency for moral behaviors and moral thoughts and moral traits that we see for other kinds of traits. And let's just see if the usual way of thinking about traits fits to morality, because as I mentioned, this has been a study that has been abandoned for many decades. People didn't even want to talk about the idea that people could be virtuous, that there's virtue traits that people can have. So one of the studies we did was, in some ways, an early test of whether there's any conceptual notion to moral traits. So what we did was we had people evaluate themselves on a number of moral traits. So honesty, fairness, self-control, and compassion. And we also had them evaluate themselves on two broader traits, kind of general moral character and moral concern, which is the extent to which they think a lot about morality. So they filled out this questionnaire about themselves, and then they nominated people from different areas of their lives who might be willing to do a short study with us. We didn't tell them why. And then we contacted those people that they nominated, and we said, would you be willing to do this study in which we're going to ask you about the person who nominated you, right? So if I filled out the survey about myself and I nominated you and 5 other people, we would contact the 6 of you and say, would you fill out a survey about Erik? So the nominee or the nominees who decided to participate did that, and we asked the question, 2 research questions. To what extent does the way I see myself on these moral traits correspond with how you see me? And to what extent do the 6 of you agree with each other about what I'm like as on these traits?
And the 6 people
go ahead.
Do they know each other, those 6 people?
Some of them could have known each other, but as a matter of fact, I think a lot of them didn't. So for example, we would have something like, my college roommate rating me along with my mom and rating me along with, a hometown friend. So they might have known each other, but what was kind of interesting was that even if they did know each other, these informants came from different sectors of life, right? So you could imagine that the way your friends would rate your character would be different in important ways from the way your mom would do it. And so the fact that we get this kind of cross-situational element to the raters, I think, is a strength of the design. Or another example, if it was a community sample, which we used in some of this work, the way your coworkers might rate you is different than how your partner might rate you, and yet both were represented in the sample. Okay. So why study agreement? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One, it's just, we thought, an interesting question in and of itself. To what extent, when I see somebody who I think is honest, do other people agree with me, and do they agree with me? But the other is a more methodological reason, which is that if you do observe agreement, what that suggests is that there must be something about the person who interacts in different ways with different people in different situations, that's stable, because somehow what's happening is these 6 informants from different areas of life are agreeing with each other, and they're agreeing with the person, him or herself. So that must mean that there's something about the way that person acts that's basically focusing everyone's perceptions on the same basic reality, right? And so that's shorthand for saying, or longhand for saying, maybe there's a trait there. Maybe there's something about my honesty or my compassion that I carry with me to different people across different situations. So what we found was that that there was agreement, that people agreed with each other about a target zone standing on these traits, and self and other agreed. So targets who were rating themselves, their ratings tended to agree with the way that others saw them, suggesting that, first of all, people's self-perceptions of these traits are not completely off the mark. They are tracking the way they're seen by others. And second, that the way a person's acting with one informant, it seems to be the way they're acting with these other informants too, because you're getting agreement there as well.
Yeah, but wouldn't they just pick people who are gonna somehow like fulfill their own view of themselves? Or the informants did, or the participants didn't know what the purpose of giving the names would be, right?
Correct. They didn't know that what these people were going to do was rate them on their character.
Right.
But you want to be able to rule out counter explanations, like, well, we might all have a stereotype of what a moral person is like, and we use that as a way of informing our ratings of one another, right? So could it just be that we're getting agreement among different informants, for example, because everybody kind of shares the same notion of what the average person's character is like? So to deal with that concern, we looked at agreement in a second way, which was for each person, we took those 4 traits of compassion, honesty, self-control, and fairness, and we composed a profile for them, right? So if I see myself as someone who's very fair, not very compassionate, and whose self-control and honesty fall somewhere in the middle, that would be my profile, right? I'm a very fair person. I have an okay amount of self-control and honesty, and I'm not very compassionate, right? That'd be my profile, and you can think about that.
So maybe I'm naive here to ask this, but these traits don't just cluster together in some way? Like, isn't there overlap? The people who are saying they're more compassionate also have higher self-control?
So it is true that they do cluster. They are correlated with each other. But just like the different facets of extroversion also correlate with each other, you can pull them apart because they both are kind of loading onto a single factor, and you could think of that as character. But they're also important subdimensions of, just as probably with empathy, the characteristics you might be interested in probably correlate with each other, but they're conceptually important, and they might even predict different things, even if they're correlated together. Good question. Yeah. So we took these 4. We made a profile, my moral profile, and then we looked at all my informants' profile. That is, how did they rank order these traits for me? And there was agreement there. So people agreed on that, and more importantly, we saw that there was agreement not only on how these traits are aligned in me, but in how these traits differentiate me from the average person. So we would subtract out from everybody's profile what the average person looks like. And now what we were seeing was that there was even agreement on how my characteristics made me different than the average person. That suggests that it's not just about stereotypes and the way we think people tend to be, but it's actually a distinct signature about me that people are agreeing on.
Yeah, that's neat. Because I do think that people have general views about what people are like in general,
Yeah.
And it's going to be like people are moral, people are honest, people are fair.
Right.
And so to the extent that they have those, you're saying that you said, okay, what do you think about people in general, and then what do you think about this specific person?
Yes.
That's really cool.
Yeah. So that was kind of a fun place. And one of the extensions of that research has been, which I think kind of dovetails with your work on empathy a little bit, has been to try to take some of these traits and separate out the internal states from the external manifestations. So you can think of any trait like fairness, for example, or compassion or empathy as having an internal component, which is sort of motivational, that a person wants to respond to the world through a particular virtue. So if they see unfairness, they get bothered by it. If they see someone suffering, they get bothered by it, right? And that's a motivational component. And you can separate out from that the behavioral component, which is they actually do something.
That people, when people are, so you found correspondence between the self and then the observers, the informants. But could the informants be using the person's outside behaviors to make the judgment while the individual is using their own emotional and cognitive information?
I think it's
they might
great.
Come to
So
the same conclusion, but
right, and I think that is probably going on because we know from work by people like Emily Cronin that people lean on their own internal states for self-assessment. But because those states aren't really available to us in others, what we do is we use behavior for others. So it's a great question. So what we did in this follow-up study, is we had people fill out for themselves a measure of their motivations, those internal states, in 4 different moral domains, right? When you see somebody suffering, it really bothers you. When you see some kind of injustice, you get really bothered by that. So you get this internal thing. And then they did a separate questionnaire on their behaviors. So it was similar kinds of behaviors, but now we're talking about what they're actually doing. Because you can imagine that a person would have the motivation to do something moral, but then not act on it. Or you could imagine that somebody does something that looks moral, but they do it for different reasons, right? And that was one of the things we assessed. Was we gave people, for any kind of moral situation, like when I encounter someone in need, we asked them to indicate how much they feel the desire to help that person, which would be the moral motive. But we also asked them how much they felt the desire to get out of the situation quickly, how much they felt the desire to reduce their own suffering, etc. So we assessed them on a number of moral motives and behaviors, and then we did the same thing we did in the study before. So we asked their peers or their informants to assess moral motives and behaviors. And what we found was that there's agreement, equal amounts of agreement on both, so that it was true that people were using behavior to assess character, but it also seemed that what people were doing was they somehow were able to detect and agreed with targets themselves on the extent to which these targets felt different moral motives. So how does that happen? It's an interesting question. I mean, some of it could be communication. We end up talking with each other. Go ahead.
it could also be perspective taking. So it could be a person saying, "Oh, this bothers me whenever I see this person, injustice." But it could just be, once you get to know a person, you start to kind of create a mental map of what their world is like, and you kind of use that to make evaluations.
Absolutely. So you think that through perspective taking, if I get to know you better, Sara, and then I sort of see the way you are in different situations, I can actually take on, to some degree, the feelings you have when you're in these situations?
Well, for example, just say you move to a new city, right?
Mm-hmm.
You drive around, say you don't have a GPS, you don't have a map, but you have to get to work every day and you have to get to the grocery store. Well, eventually, over time, if you're just driving around using the old school methodology, your mind, you will create a mental map of the city. And I think the same thing happens with our relationships with others, that just by experience with them, we start to create these like pretty in-depth maps of them. Now, they're not always accurate, but I think that neither are the maps in our mind when we're driving.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a fascinating question how we do that. Right. It can be through communication. I tell you a story about how I passed this person in the street who asked me for money and it really bothered me, and now you know that about me and you can put that into your mental map of me. And it could be from behavior, right? We sort of observe, oh, Erik seems to help in these situations, but not these, and that must mean that he cares about the person or something like this. Or Erik seems to help even when it disadvantages him, and so now I know that there must be something about him that really is worked up when he sees someone in need, because why would he help otherwise? So it's kind of interesting because even though we're seeing agreement, you and I can agree on my moral motives, for example. You might have understood those motives in a different way than I understand them, right? You're getting them from some other source than I am, which is my own introspections. And yet we're still able to agree on it.
I wonder how you could actually get at the source, though. Like, I mean, I guess you'd have to. It'd be hard to do artificially, but just like what. It would be really interesting to know what kinds of information people are using when they're making those judgments about other people's motives.
Absolutely. One thing we have seen in the data, and again, this study has not been written up. It's a pretty new study, but we also asked people to evaluate their own or their friends' broad character. Just how good is this? Is this person virtuous? Are they ethical? Are they good? Right? And we did see differences in how information was used. So people evaluated their own character. There was more weight given to motives in evaluating character for yourself than there was in evaluating the character of another person. And behavior was valued more for evaluating another person's character than one's own. So it does seem that, so yes, we're getting information about both behavior and motives, but maybe we're using that information differently to assess our own versus other people's character.
But don't people just think like their friends are just good, just honest and good and compassionate? Like, if you're using friends as informants, then that seems plausible.
So there is, yes, by and large, people that we like and that we know well tend to be high on these traits. And that in some way makes it all the more impressive that we're seeing agreement, because essentially what's happened is, instead of having a range of moral ratings from here to here, we're evaluating this range. And to still see agreement means that people are making pretty fine distinctions between people, and that those distinctions are being shared by a range of other observers. So yes, you're right, people do hold their friends in pretty high esteem for the most part. And yet, even with that restriction, there's still careful differences that are being reflected by different observers.
This is really fascinating work. I think it almost does come full circle from those studies in the early days, like as a Hawthorne and May.
Hartshorne and May.
Yeah, exactly. That we're trying to do this by putting the children in these different situations and measuring like how honest are they, how much are they likely to help.
Right.
But their claim was that those behaviors are basically uncorrelated, or only very small correlation.
So they found, one of the things that is not talked about with Hartshorne and May is, it was true that for individual behaviors, the correlation tended to be around 0.2, right? So if you knew that a kid cheated in the tail on the donkey, you could know a little bit that they're more likely than a kid who didn't cheat to also cheat on a test, but the signal's not very strong. 0.2 is pretty weak in terms of predictive signature. However, even in their own book, they said that if you could just aggregate behaviors, so one behavior might not tell you about personality, right? Any feature of personality, right? If we want to know, are you more of a morning person or a night owl, right? We wouldn't just look at when you got up this morning, because that could be affected by lots of different things. But what we want to know is, over 14 days, what time did Sara get up? So Hartshorne and May knew that if you just look at one behavior, you're going to get a weaker correlation, because that can be caused by lots of things. But if you aggregate, you should get a stronger predictive signal, and that's certainly something we found in our work. So in everything we've done, and this doesn't have to do with the agreement stuff, but other work I've done, the correlation between how honest you are, how compassionate you are in any one moment, and how honest or compassionate you are in another moment is significant, and it's there, but it's it can range from 0.3 to 0.5, right? But if you aggregate, so we take 10 observations of your honesty or compassion and say how well does that predict any other 10 observations, those correlations can go up to 0.8, 0.9. So if you allow your measurement of the trait to take in all the relevant information that needs to be taken in, you get a pretty reliable and robust signal of character.
Wasn't it interesting that we're both social psychologists, and here we are saying, like, here's some evidence that we take to mean that character matters.
Absolutely.
Because, the social psychology, at least the extreme version of social psychology, is saying, well, it's situational, totally situational. Everybody's just influenced by whatever happens to be in the room at the time.
And yet, and that's the social psychology, I think, that draws a lot of us in. And yet, I think all of us know that can't possibly be true, because if it were true, if that were the end of the story, none of us would go on first dates, and none of us would ever do job interviews, and none of us would ever do it if what we really believed was that a person was completely different from situation to situation.
Yeah.
So this has been great. I think we've sort of run into the limit of our time, but it's really great to talk with you, Sara.
Yeah, you too, and hope we can continue our conversations off camera.
Terrific. Thanks everybody for watching.